and welcome everybody to this lecture. Today we will talk about drivers of Indian monsoon and teleconnections through which they connected to monsoon. Basically, as you know, the Indian monsoon has a lot of interannual variability, and we have discussed this over the several lectures. And this is the ISMR, or Indian monsoon rainfall, normalized rainfall time series for almost 200 years, and you can see that there are considerable amount of interannual variability. Of course, even on the top of that internal variability, there is a certain amount of interdecadal variability. The question is then, what drives these variability of monsoon, year-to-year variability of monsoon? And this has been, of course, a very important science question for a long time. And monsoon scientists have worked over the last century to understand some aspects of this. And what I will do today is try to summarize some of that. And what do we know about major drivers of monsoon interannual variability? Obviously, we see here that there is certain association with the El Nino and sudden oscillation. These red and blue dots are related to El Ninos and La Ninas, and there appears to be a strong negative association, which has been recognized way back in early 20th century, and we have been studying this over a period of time, and I'll talk about that at some length. But there are also a lot of variability that is not related to ENSO, and therefore we need to understand what are those driven by. And that is a real main problem. ENSO relationship has been discussed, has been identified by Gilbert Walker way back in early 20th century, but there were a lot of uncertainty about what drives the other part of variability of monsoon. That's quite a lot of variability of monsoon was not related to El Nino, and that is what we will try to focus today. So how do we actually look for drivers? And so what basically, traditionally, what do we do is essentially look for association. We have certain indices of monsoon, like the ISMR is one of the index of the monsoon, and we try to find out the relationship between ISMR and other potential drivers. Now, how can we look for potential drivers? We have to look for potential drivers. Potential drivers will be those climate modes which can produce circulation changes in the atmosphere through which they can connect from a distance to monsoon. And for that matter, basically there are a few potential possibilities, and that is what people have looked at. For example, sea surface temperature is one possibility, because sea surface temperature can produce evaporation. Evaporation can give rise to clouds. Clouds can then produce atmospheric heating. Atmospheric heating can produce circulation changes, and these circulation changes then can teleconnect from some other place to monsoon. So therefore, sea surface temperature is a good, and people have explored correlation between such sea surface temperature and monsoon to find out from different places where sea surface temperature could possibly influence monsoon. And then we have some of the connections, like the El Nino itself is one of those things that we could identify through such correlations. There are also other things like sea level pressure, mean sea level pressure, because mean sea level surface pressure differences, gradients will produce surface temperature gradients, will produce the winds, and those pressure gradients will produce wind. Winds will then produce circulation, which can also connect, and therefore surface pressure MSLP is one thing that people have looked at, and correlation with MSLP. The other thing that is, of course, yes.
By MSLP, do you mean sea level height?
Do you mean sea level pressure at sea level?
So
not sea level height. Sea level height is no. These are the atmospheric pressure at sea level.
Okay. Okay, that may or may not be correlated with the height.
No, not exactly.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
So because it is the weight of the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is getting changed by heating. The heating changes produces
Okay.
atmosphere. The weight of the column of the atmosphere change from different places, and that changes the pressure at the surface. And that pressure, the surface pressure, is produces surface pressure gradient, and surface pressure gradient will produce winds. So therefore, that is one possibility people look at.
Okay.
Other is, of course, there are many others, but one of the other things that people had looked at before is a snow cover. The snow cover in the extratropics, in subtropics and extratropics, like in Eurasia, and that has been correlated with monsoon. And why that can affect monsoon? That is because snow cover can affect radiation balance locally, and radiation balance can affect the surface temperature. So surface temperature affected in different places. Somewhere snow affects and somewhere it doesn't affect. That produces north-south surface temperature gradient. That surface temperature gradient can affect the surface pressure gradient, and therefore it can also affect the circulation. So therefore, that there is also conceptually it is possible that if there is a correlation, there is a physical mechanism through which this correlation of snow and monsoon could come through some circulation teleconnection. But we need to understand that we need any teleconnection, we have to try to understand them in the process. The internal variability of monsoon is the variability of the mean, right? And we have a model for the mean today. And today, in the last lecture, I discussed the model for the mean. And now we can think about the teleconnections or the drivers also through this framework of mean model, because the mean model depends on the north-south temperature, tropospheric temperature gradient, not the surface temperature gradient as such. Therefore, anything that can, any processes that could influence this tropospheric temperature gradient through a remote circulation connection could influence the monsoon. So therefore, this is a framework through which we can actually look at the external drivers and also teleconnections through which they can influence the monsoon. So for example, some drivers can actually influence the tropospheric temperature in the northern box, some like the El Nino and North Atlantic SST, and whereas some other drivers like the Indian Ocean dipole mode, for example, will locally affect the tropospheric temperature in this region, and therefore also affect the north-south temperature gradient. So therefore, there are different drivers in a different way can influence the tropospheric temperature, and that gives us a framework to look at teleconnections and also potential drivers. So that is a kind of framework that we can think about. And throughout this lecture, and I will actually talk about that. We'll discuss all the teleconnections through this framework. So what are the external drivers and internal drivers? So the external drivers are those which are which come sort of climate modes which are sort of remotely located from monsoon region, and therefore and possibly very slowly, and those drivers can be then called, because they are located remotely, they have to connect monsoon through some circulation teleconnection, and therefore you can consider them as external drivers. There are many examples like that: El Nino, sudden oscillation, and ISMR, the AMO ISMR, PDO ISMR, Atlantic Nino ISMR, relationship. All these are don't get too much worried about these. These are names of different climate modes in the atmosphere. El Nino sudden oscillation is one more in the equatorial Pacific. Atlantic multidecadal variability or Atlantic multidecadal oscillation is in North Atlantic temperature variations. Pacific decadal oscillation is related to the temperature variations in the North Pacific. Atlantic Nino is something like the Pacific Nino, where there is also a temperature anomaly around the equator, which can vary somewhat similar to the equatorial Pacific, and that is also called, that is why it is called Atlantic Nilo. So these are known climate modes of variability. They have certain effects in the atmosphere, and through that effect, they can potentially influence the monsoon, and some associations have been established through these, and we are still trying to understand in detail what is the physical mechanism through which they influence, and also to quantify the contribution of those relationships to the monsoon variability. So they are important because the external drivers are important because most of these external drivers have variability which is much slower than the annual cycle of the monsoon, which monsoon has the major component is the annual cycle. So anything that affects it, if it has a variability which is periodicity which is much longer than the annual cycle, like El Nino has about 4-year periodicity, and the others also like AMO or the Atlantic multidigital variability has major variability in 60-year period or something like that. So these are very much slowly varying, and therefore they are much more predictable. Anything slowly varying, that is a predictability, at least one season in advance, it guarantees a predictability of that. Therefore, once they are predictable, if they are through their association, monsoon becomes predictable. Therefore, they are sources of potential predictability of the monsoon. That is why they are important. Therefore, we need to understand them. We need to simulate them correctly in the models so that models can realize the potential predictability. So understanding their mechanisms and teleconnections is important in realizing their potential predictability in the models. What is internal variability? Internal variability in the sense that internal here refers to something, the variability drivers are somewhat local in the monsoon region. And this local meaning that there could be local ocean atmosphere interactions like the Indian Ocean Dipole mode. I would consider it as internal to the monsoon system. This is local. So therefore, even if it is ocean atmosphere interaction is there, it may be predictable. So the Indian Ocean Dipole mode may be a predictable local driver, which may be considered as a sort of predictable internal driver. On the other hand, there are high frequency variabilities which can lead to a contribution to the seasonal mean. For example, land atmosphere feedback also can lead to certain contribution to the seasonal mean hitting, and that seasonal mean hitting could give rise to as a component of the rainfall in the monsoon, and therefore land atmosphere interaction could give rise to, which normally happens on somewhat faster time scale compared to decision sometimes, and therefore those high frequency variabilities can lead to certain contribution to the seasonal mean, which are also internal variability. Similarly, the high frequency subseasonal oscillation, we are going to talk about in the next lecture. There is a significant subseasonal oscillations. There are synaptic variabilities, but more than synaptic variability, there are 10 to 20 day oscillation, there is 30 to 60 day oscillation in the monsoon. These are the intra-seasonal. Within the season, there are large oscillations, and these oscillations are higher frequency compared to the seasonal mean, and these, but however, they result in a certain contribution to the seasonal mean. Therefore, that part of the contribution of the high frequency to the seasonal mean is internal variability, and that variability may or may not be predictable, and that is a separate issue, but that contribution is there, and that contribution is known as the internal variability. So some of these can come from, some of those which are not associated with El Nino possibly come from some of these internal variability, and we'll try to see if we can understand some of that. Of course, there is the exploration for external drivers for the monsoon. There is a very long history in India, because India Meteorological Department was actually set up to identify such drivers which are predictable. And because in the late 19th century and early part of 20th century, there were several episodes of bad droughts, and that prompted the British to seriously take up this problem, and they deputed some very bright and scientists to head this India meteorological department, like Blandford, and later Sir Gilbert Walker. They came, and right away the IMD was set up in 1875, and of course at that time it was, the head was called meteorological reporter to the government of India. But later on, they have been converted into Director General of IMD. But their job was to actually find out the predictable drivers, and then developed prediction models for seasonal monsoon, seasonal mean monsoon. And in fact, Blandford immediately find out some relationship between Himalayan snow and monsoon, and then that used that as a predictor. It didn't work very well, but it was beginning. Then later on, Sir Gilbert Walker came in, and he discovered this. So he actually looked at systematically the correlations between the Indian monsoon rainfall and winds, wheat, and many of the global climate modes. As I mentioned, climate modes means anywhere like El Nino and sudden oscillation and any other global different parts of the globe. And in that doing that, he discovered that the pressure variations in the east and west of Pacific go out of phase, and that seemed to is strongly related to the Indian monsoon, and that is how he discovered the sudden oscillation. And then the association between sudden oscillation and monsoon. Of course, that immediately afterwards was known that the sudden oscillation is part of an atmospheric component of the oceanic component of El Nino, and therefore the El Nino and sudden oscillation became the important. It was an important discovery which had an important implications on monsoon variability and predictability. So this is how it started. With that, the search for predictors, for external predictors, continued, and people over the years have discovered several other such potential predictors. I felt two amongst them are, one is of course the Indian monsoon rainfall and the El Nino and sudden oscillation, which I'm going to talk about a little detail. And then there is another one where people have been for a long time. There were associations found between the cooling over the North Atlantic and droughts over India. From paleoclimatic records to the decadal time scale, time scales. This was known, but the mechanism through which that was the North Atlantic SST could influence the monsoon was not known until very recently. So this is something I will discuss in this talk. So. And these are some few sort of representative references, but there is a lot of work on El Nino and sudden oscillation and monsoon relationship. This is not exhaustive, but ISMR and North Atlantic SST relationship is relatively new, and therefore the amount of work, volume of work is not all that much, but it is building up now. So in addition to that, there are also other modes like the Pacific decadal oscillations and Atlantic Nino, as I mentioned, sudden annular mode, which happens in the Antarctic, the southern hemisphere, and these variations of the currents and zonal winds in this region, and that which is dependent on the pressure gradient in this region, are also found to be associated with monsoon. Then, of course, there is Indian monsoon dipole mode, and of course, even the sunspot cycle has been related to the monsoon. So all these I am not going to be able to discuss in details, but in addition to that, of course, there is the snow cover and monsoon relationship. As I said, it was also found that there is some relationship between the European snow cover and Indian monsoon, and it has gone through several evolutions. But again, I am not going to go into great details here because of the time limit. And but the point is that all these, apart from these two that I mentioned, these other the associations are important, very important, because they may be important today when the El Nino and monsoon relationship seem to be weakening in the recent years. if El Nino and monsoon relationship has weakened, because their general correlations have been found to be weaker than and the maximum that ENSO ISMR had over a long period of time. But in the recent years, El Nino and monsoon time relationships seem to have weakened. When they have weakened, even these might contribute to the predictability of the monsoon, and therefore they are important, and we need to study them carefully and find out the contributions of them and understand the mechanism behind them. However, still there is a lot of debates and discussions going on in this. They are not as well studied as the El Nino monsoon relationship have been. Therefore, I think as the time goes, we'll be having a better idea of those. So to understand the El Nino monsoon relationship, then let me talk about that first. Then we need some indices. Of course, for Indian monsoon, we have the ISMR index, which is the rainfall index, average over the Indian monsoon continent. Then there are indices of monsoon, ENSO, El Nino, and sudden oscillation, which are normally based on the sea surface temperature anomalies in the equatorial Indian Ocean at different locations. So there are several indices are often used for different purposes. Most commonly used at the temperature at the center of these sort of canonical El Nino pattern, that is El Nino 3 or Nino 3.4. If you take the sea surface temperature in this region and average it, and then do a regression or correlation with a sea surface temperature over the whole globe, then you have a pattern like this, which is essentially a canonical pattern associated with the monsoon, the El Nino. And that this canonical pattern is, of course, is canonical, but it is not. But there is a lot of variability. There are different sets of El Nino. Sometimes there is sort of EP El Nino, Eastern Pacific El Nino, Central Pacific El Nino, and so event to event variability is there. And that does not, this kind of a correlation does not tell you those details, but that is a question of details, and therefore it gives us a measure of sort of at least the general El Nino sudden oscillation phenomenon, and represents the canonical phenomenon, and then its relationship with monsoon can be studied. Similarly, for the North Atlantic SST, we can use an index of North Atlantic SST averaged in this box, which there are several other indices people have used, but we have normally used an index which is it's equivalent to most of the other indices, but because that is where most of the large anomalies are located. So if I take an SST available averaged over these during the June to September months and plot it over this period, you see this index has a large. The internal variability is relatively weak, but there is a large multi-decadal variability. So this is called Atlantic multi-decadal variability, and we will focus on that. And this multi-decadal variability has a lot of implications on different climate over the world, and therefore it has been studied, and there are still certain debates about its origin, but it has definitely some relationship with monsoon, and we will try to understand that. And this again, if I do a correlation or a regression over the whole world, this is associated with sea surface temperature variability in the globe like this. So it is sort of negatively correlated in this equatorial region, and there is Atlantic, this Pacific decadal variability region has a positive correlation with this, and this is a dipole pattern in the northern and southern hemisphere. Over the monsoon region, there is a negative SST anomalies in this region. So these are some important aspects of this variability, which will have implications in this teleconnections. So let us focus on the ENSO-monsoon relationship. How can we quantify this ENSO-monsoon relationship? As I said, there is definitely from the eyeball picture, you can say that that there's a negative relationship between the El Nino and monsoon rainfall. Therefore, to quantify this, we can do a long-term correlation between this time series of El Nino and El Nino time series. So I can take monthly time series, monthly SST anomaly over the Nino 3 area, that box I mentioned, and correlate this as a reference time series. If I do that, the correlation at zero lag will be about 0.5. So that is actually over a long period of time, that's a very significant correlation. However, if I do a lead or lag correlation, suppose I use, suppose I consider the ISMR to be centered around July, and consider which is the July SST over the Nino 3, then that is a simultaneous correlation. If I take June SST 1 month before, and if we take a August SST the 1 month later, and so on and so forth. If I do that, lead lag correlations between the ISMR index as a reference time series and SST over the Nino 3 area, then it turns out that the maximum negative correlation happens not simultaneously, but after the monsoon, about 3 to 4 months after the monsoon, sometime around September, October, November is when the maximum correlation takes place. So this is a curious thing. Of course, this then comes back, and then it is positive correlation about 1 year before that. The correlation is positive, and so on. So this indicates that something interesting is indicated by this, that El Nino, probably monsoon is not just a slave to the El Nino, but monsoon possibly could influence the El Nino, and probably that is why probably as it evolves, monsoon also affects and makes its SST anomalies stronger after the monsoon, leading to larger correlation after the monsoon. So this is what makes that it may be a two-way interaction rather than just one-way interaction. But that apart, now we can ask this question whether this correlation over a long period of time is stationary. Is this stationary or it is changing? It turns out that it is not stationary. So if I do a sort of running window correlation, this is a 21-year running window correlation. Take 21 years here, and then take now here I am talking about June to September 4-month mean ISMR and 4-month mean SST over that Nino 3 area, and then 21-month correlation, and so you have a value. Then you slide it by 1 month and 1 year, and then do it again, and so on and so forth. If you do that, you get the moving correlation indicates that the correlation remains quite strong in the early days, all the way up to about 1960. But after that, slowly, this is using the data, the IITM data, means that Pathasarathi, I mentioned during one of the talks that different rainfall data sets, and Pathasarathi et al. Data set is created by at IITM, which is one of the best sort of quality control data set for internal variability. So if we do that data set, it shows that okay, it continues about 0.65 level up to about 1960, then start decreasing, and it decreases to almost 0, and then it seems to be increasing again in the very recent years. So so there is a lot of epochal variations or multi-decadal variations of these association. It is not stationary. Now, by using other data set, this is India Meteorological Department IMD data set, which is used by from the one of the I think it is Pi et al. Data sets, where you get also similar things, but it is still decreasing in that data set. So it depends also data set that you use. So as I mentioned, this data set may have some sampling issues, and therefore there were more noise in that data set. Therefore, it may have a little bit of an issue. So, but this is the I think reliable fact that the monsoon relationship weakened, but appears to be increasing again in the recent years. Now, how does it affect the monsoon? It affects through this teleconnection, equatorial teleconnection, through what is known as the Walker circulation. So this is the kind of east-west circulation that the heating associated with in the rainfall over the equatorial belt produces on a climatological sense. It produces ascending motion in the Western Pacific, descending motion here, and there is weak ascending motion in the Eastern Indian Ocean, and therefore descending motion in the Arabian side. So this picture is a sort of climatological picture. During El Nino and El Nino, what happens? Suppose you took a composite of several number of El Nino events and do the Walker circulation. It turns out this is the Walker circulation during 11 El Nino events, and it turns out that it changes. It produces ascending motion now in the Central Pacific, because the rain belt has now moved to the Central Pacific, and therefore then there is descending motion here in the Western Pacific, and now this region where there is ascending motion now is replaced by descending motion. In the Indian Ocean, this weak ascending motion has become very strong. That is, you remember in the south of equator, we have a rain belt. There has to be some ascending motion there, and there is larger ascending motion in the north, and that produces descending motion further south in the equator. But at around 5 degrees, there is still some weak ascending motion. Now, what happens during monsoon, El Nino? This becomes much stronger. It produces an anomalous ascending motion here, and that anomalous ascending motion produces somewhat subsidence motion to the north, and thereby weakens the monsoon. There suppresses the convection, and therefore weakens the monsoon. This is one way of connecting through the equatorial teleconnection. There is also a pathway through which they can influence the monsoon through a subtropical or extratropical teleconnection. This happens to the tropospheric temperature gradient, and that, as you remember, this is our tropospheric temperature gradient, and this is the onset, withdrawal, length of the rainy season. Now, how does it affect? How does it actually connect the El Nino? How does El Nino connect to monsoon through this tropospheric temperature gradient? It does through the length of the rainy season. So now for every year, I have a length of the rainy season. So I can actually, from tropospheric temperature gradient, every year I can calculate what is the length of the rainy season. Sometimes it becomes longer, sometimes it becomes shorter. And this length of the rainy season variation is associated with, is correlated. Suppose I take those years for all the years and then correlated with the SST over the whole globe, it turns out that pattern of correlation is very similar to the pattern of the El Nino. So this is an SST pattern which is correlated with the Nino 3 SST itself. So therefore, that is a canonical pattern of El Nino and sudden oscillation. And here, the correlation with June, July, August, September SST and the length of the rainy season also is very similar, and it is pretty strong. And that indicates that the length of the rainy season is somehow controlled by the El Nino and sudden oscillation. How do they control it? And they control it by expanding in the El Nino years. They contract this length of this rainy season. So if you do a composite of the whole tropospheric temperature gradient during El Nino years and La Nina years, you find that during El Nino, the length of the rainy season is contracted. During La Nina, the length of the is expanded. By expanding the length of the rainy season, it's adding more rain, and that is what is increasing the rain. In addition to that, it can also increase the amplitude, but it is by this itself it can introduce a certain amount of variability into the monsoon. And therefore, now how does it do that? It does it by producing the tropospheric temperature anomaly. So if we do a composite, a sort of El Nino composite and La Nina composite of tropospheric temperature during May and September, we find there is a huge negative anomaly sitting during El Nino here, and that persists throughout the season all the way to the. So this is a slow revarying thing. Therefore, it is persisting there, and that essentially produces weakens the north-south temperature gradient. The weakened north-south temperature gradient is overcome. It takes that weak temperature gradient to overcome and become positive, it takes it takes longer time, and therefore the onset is delayed. And if the temperature gradient is already large, then to become it positive to the north, it takes earlier. It can happen earlier because without smaller perturbation can bring it to the north. And so that is what is the way it affects. To understand this hypothesis, then we actually did some general circulation model, the global climate model experiment, in which we introduce forcing at the surface, bottom surface, with sea surface temperatures associated with El Nino, where there is positive anomaly here, and there is La Nina, where there is negative anomaly here. So let the model respond to these, assess the anomalies, and see how it affects the convection and the atmospheric rainfall and days rainfall, how it affects the tropospheric temperature in globally. And that when you do look at the differences between the El Nino and La Nina simulations, you find exactly same type of tropospheric temperature anomalies in the northern Indian regions. And this indeed is the mechanism by which, now how does El Nino actually do that? They do it essentially because during El Nino time there is enhanced precipitation in the this is a composite of precipitation anomaly during El Nino years and La Nina years. This is let me see. This is enhanced precipitation. This is decreased precipitation. So El Nino, yes, there is enhanced precipitation in the Central Pacific. The Central Pacific will produce a lot of convection in that region. That convection actually keeps on perturbing the atmosphere and produce atmospheric wave response. Atmospheric Rossby waves produced by this convective activity in the Central Pacific then propagate around the globe, set up stationary structure, stationary wave, and that stationary wave produces advection of temperature anomalies that lead to those anomalies. So in the north, and therefore affect the north-south temperature gradient, and that is how it produces delayed onset and withdrawal. So with that, I'll stop here. Maybe then we'll go to the next is mostly okay. This is little bit of discussion we'll have as we go. So I'll stop here for a few minutes, and then we can okay. Then we'll come back to that then towards the end again.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So as you know that the tropospheric temperature gradient gives a sort of a framework to understand these relationships also, and as the after the onset, the rainfall itself affects the tropospheric temperature. Therefore, the positive part of the tropospheric temperature gradient, therefore, is a combination of this large scale SST, large scale temperature produced by the large scale external forces plus the local rainfall that affects the tropospheric temperature. And therefore, I can actually define a new tropospheric, new index of monsoon rainfall based on tropospheric temperature, which is a positive part of the tropospheric temperature gradient. So we have defined a thermodynamic index of Indian monsoon, which is nothing but the area under this positive delta TT. And if we do that, then it turns out that this index is very strongly correlated with the rainfall of during the monsoon season. Suppose you we know the length of the rainy season itself actually changes from year to year, but during that period, whatever the rainfall is accumulated, that rainfall, if you take from year to year and correlated with this index, of the tropospheric temperature the area or thermodynamic index of the monsoon, it is correlates very strongly. And therefore this is another way of looking at relationship. So instead of rainfall now, if I take this as the index of monsoon, then you go and correlate with SST, sea surface temperature, NiNO3 temperature at the, it turns out that correlation, that is what I was telling you that correlation has not changed very much. Although if I take the rainfall correlation with the rainfall, or even the rainfall which is during the monsoon season, that correlation, the moving correlation, decreases significantly. So in fact, we have done that over the this extended it to recent years, and my colleague just did these calculations, and we find that this tropospheric temperature relationship with the in fact is very stable and very strong. So in other words, and that is largely affected by the rain, by El Nino, as well as maybe the North Atlantic SST as well. So therefore, this combined effect of El Nino and North Atlantic SST, the relationship remains very strong.
BNG?
Yeah.
We don't understand the difference between A and B. In one of the graphs, it doesn't seem very strong.
Right. No, so I'm going to, so this is between the TISM or the thermodynamic index and NiNO3, and this is with rainfall. RF is rainfall. So rainfall and SST. So rainfall and SST relations were strong. They started becoming weak and became rather weak in recent years, very weak. Okay. Whether you take the LRS, means length of the rainy season rainfall, or the season June to September rainfall, both of them, in fact, LRS actually we can see even further. That means it gives me the idea that rainfall itself, the seasonal mean rainfall, is affected by some high frequency noise which decorrelates this. If we just remove the rainfall and take something temperature dependent index of monsoon, and which is essentially the heating equivalent to the heating that happens during the monsoon season, and that has its own variability. And if I can use that, it does not reduce, and that is sort of allows us a way to extract the predictable component of this ENSO-monsoon relationship, and therefore the predictability has not changed from the ENSO-monsoon. It is just the predictability has decreased because of noise that is introduced in the atmosphere, which affects the by the global warming or whatever and that affects the rainfall variability, which rainfall variability contributes certain amount of stochastic noise into the seasonal mean. That stochastic noise reduces the correlation. That is our hypothesis, but it is still sort of could be debated. So this is what basically we think that the tropospheric temperature gradient the framework actually gives a handle to bring out the predictable component of the ENSO-monsoon relationship. So with that, I'll stop the discussion on the ENSO-monsoon relationship. Then we'll move over to the discussion on the North Atlantic SST and the monsoon relationship. So this there is a lot of as I said, that the ENSO-monsoon relationship, even in the best time, the correlation is as large as 0.6, like 0.65. So this explains how much of the variability. This is explains about 36% of the 35% of the internal variability of the monsoon. Therefore, there is a lot of variability that is not correlated with monsoon. So we need to understand. We have to bring out find out what are the factors that affect those variability. And one of the such factor possibly is the North Atlantic SST, and there has been and I'll demonstrate that indeed it actually adds predictability to the monsoon, the additional predictability to the monsoon. there has been a lot of paleoclimatic records, I mean the evidence which indicates that the Atlantic cooling has been always associated with some mega droughts in the monsoon region, and that on centennial and longer time scales. But during the past about 15-20 years, the physical mechanism of this teleconnection has been understood better, and now we have a much better handle on how the North Atlantic SST could influence, because there are a lot of conceptual barrier of how North Atlantic SST could influence, because those SST variations, mean SST in those regions are much lower, like 18 degrees mean, and even if there is 2 degrees anomaly, those anomalies, how does it influence the atmosphere? It has to connect to atmospheric circulation, but how does it influence the atmosphere? This was had a problem, and I'll discuss that in a few minutes, how it could, and that is why a lot of people had difficulty in actually believing the correlations between them. So it has to teleconnect, but how it will teleconnect? Because the SSTs somehow cannot affect the atmospheric circulation very easily in the extratropics. So, but we are beginning to understand that there is a way to do that, and and that is what. So these are some of the relationships which I will not go into great details, but in this paper, this study showed that on millennium time scales, these are records from the Greenland ice core, from the oxygen isotopes of isotope records, the temperature information you can get, so temperature variability, and these oscillations are related to what is known as Dansgaard-Osgaard oscillations. These are something like about 2 millennial oscillations, so it's very slow oscillation. And during this time, there are records from this Mumi cave in Socotra Island, Arabian Sea, and Hulu cave in China, also show variations which are very consistent with the variations of these temperature in this region. And so all these events seem to have similar variations of rainfall, decreasing rainfall in cold phases, and increased rainfall in the opposite phases, and that rain variations indicated that there must be some relationship between North Atlantic SST and on millennium time scale. Then there are other people who showed that there, even on centennial time scale. So this is during the Holocene. These were a much longer period, earlier period. So during Holocene, there are records in the zebuloids. This is an organism in the ocean which thrive on the surface dwelling organism which thrive when there is upwelling and nutrients in the upper atmosphere, and then lot of their number increases. So the stronger winds produce upwelling, and therefore upwelling in the Arabian coast produces increased concentration of these, and therefore this can be seen in the sediments. And from sediment records, you can actually find out the abundances of these creatures, and then their cells, and from their cell count, you can actually find out the periods when there are larger abundance and less periods when there are lesser abundance. From that, those are seem to be quite strongly associated with similar variations of other organisms in the North Atlantic, which are also sensitive to temperature. So they have a similar association and these time scales are fluctuations are in a centennial time scale. So these there seems to be association between these strong winds. Again, as I mentioned, the strong winds are related to the strong monsoons. We hope in these years now, and the stronger winds and stronger monsoon is related to warmer temperatures in the Atlantic, and the colder temperature, the droughts and the weaker monsoon is related to the colder temperature in the Atlantic. So these are again, these are associations have been noted from paleoclimatic data. However, if we look at the time series in the recent years, the time series of the rainfall and the time series of the sea surface temperature during summer over the North Atlantic, they are rather non-linear in the sense that the variability is very, very different. This the monsoon time series has a dominant about quasi biennial oscillation 2.5 2.7 years, and it has a weak multi-decadal variability and a relatively weak trend. But the SST in this North Atlantic has a relatively strong trend and a strong multi-decadal variability, very weak interannual variability. So in a sense, time series change, they are non-linear, they are very non-linear. Therefore, if we try to look at linear correlations, we may not get much of a linear correlation. But therefore, we have to bring out their associations by using proper signal processing in some sense. So what we found some time back is that if we remove the internal variations and concentrate on the multi-decadal component, do a 7-year running mean of the SST time series, and it seems to correlate quite well with the monsoon time series during this period. And then we proposed some sort of a mechanism through which the preliminary mechanism through which they can influence each other. Based on that, we have now built up more better understanding of the process. That was in the multi-decadal times, multi-decadal. So from centennial, there was association. Now we see that there is association on the multi-decadal time scale also. Then a recent study, Bora et al., has shown that there is a very strong association on the interannual time scale. Now, how did they do that? They looked at later 100 plus years data, where good data is available. Here, if you look at this is the monsoon time series again, where we have identified the drought years which are associated with red years are the drought years which are associated with El Nino. But there are many drought years which are not associated with El Nino. They are marked by blue. So there are out of 23, 13 were ENSO-related drought years, and there are 10 non-ENSO drought years. Now you do a June to September sea surface temperature anomaly composite for all the El Nino drought years and non-El Nino drought years. And what do you see? So this is where the El Nino drought years, you expect that there is an El Nino signal, very strong equatorial SST anomaly here. There is a weak SST, negative SST anomaly in Atlantic and North Pacific, but dominated by this El Nino signal. But during non-El Nino drought year, the largest SST anomaly is North Atlantic cooling. And there is nothing in the equatorial region. And this is a very interesting factor, that in the equatorial region, there is no signal of El Nino, absolutely nothing. And that means that, that it appears, two things are important here. One is that, there is large SST anomaly, and this association, there must be a linkage between the cooling of this SST in the North Atlantic. This is the only signal, sea surface temperature signal that we can see. So that there must be a association, I mean the mechanism by which this SST anomaly can affect the droughts over India. But the other important factor is that all the non-ENSO droughts are related to these. So, and all the El Nino droughts are the rest of the droughts are associated with El Nino. In other words, El Nino, we know that the North Atlantic SST has a sort of multi-decadal variability, strongest, slowly varying. It is a very slowly varying, and therefore there is predictability. So El Nino, the non-El Nino droughts are predictable. The other droughts are associated with El Nino, they are also predictable. So that means this study has come out with this fact that all the droughts of Indian monsoon are either related to El Nino or related to North Atlantic SST. Therefore, all the droughts are predictable. And that, I think, is a very important message that has come out of this study. And that indicates that our droughts, we have more predictability. The monsoon has a lot of predictability. We have to simply capture it. How do we capture it is up to us. You have to develop better models. That's all. So therefore, so this is then the question they asked also is how does it affect how does it influence the monsoon? So to do that, they looked at the circulation. How does it connect through circulation? How does it connect the North Atlantic SST with the so during those years, non and so drought years, they did a upper atmosphere the sort of circulation anomaly composite during the summer season at different heights. There's upper atmosphere, middle atmosphere, lower atmosphere, and so on. And it turns out that there is a very beautiful sort of stationary wave train structure at the upper atmosphere, which seems to originate from this North Atlantic and then sort of sets up the structure and produces during the drought years, during this cold anomaly years, it produces a cyclonic circulation over upper atmosphere in the Indian region. Cyclonic circulation, you remember, our normal circulation is basically a anticyclonic circulation over the monsoon. So a anomaly which is a cyclonic anomaly is essentially an indication of reduction of that anticyclone. Reduction of anticyclone is associated with weakening of the monsoon. It implies a weakening of the monsoon, but there is also, of course, more complicated than that. But that is an indication that it can influence the upper atmospheric. Through that upper atmosphere, it can influence the lower atmospheric. At lower atmosphere over the monsoon region, it generates a anticyclonic anomaly, and that anticyclonic anomaly weakens the monsoon. So question is still there are missing links like how exactly does this produces this, but it is a very interesting linkage through which it connects through the monsoon, and this is a very plausible and it turns out that this structure is what you call barotropic. If you look at this at 500 millimeters same site, even at 700 millibar, in the extratropics, it is remains barotropic in the sense that the sign, vorticity sign does not change. But when it comes to monsoon, over the Indian monsoon, lower atmosphere, it changes, because in the monsoon circulation is during summer is baroclinic, and therefore but to the north this this vorticity remains barotropic. So this is the way. So therefore, in addition to this sort of this signal that we get, that it has a predictable signal it produces in producing the droughts, non-answered droughts, it also provides a mechanism through which it can influence the monsoon. And so it seems from this study, as well as this varietal study, there another study that we did using a GCM experiment, where we put sea surface temperature anomaly in the North Atlantic and simulated the monsoon rainfall in the monsoon region by using a GCM. And it turns and we changed the different sea surface temperature anomalies in the North Atlantic, and found out that when there is no El Nino signal in the tropics, in the equatorial region, when it goes to a transition, the North Atlantic SST anomaly, whether it is positive or negative, it can influence the monsoon in a positive or negative way, but not when the El Nino signal in the equatorial Pacific is very strong. Then the North Atlantic SST cannot influence the monsoon very large. So therefore, the North Atlantic sea surface temperature seems to impact monsoon only when equatorial SST anomaly is near neutral. But it can happen because that several times. For example, the North Atlantic variability has the major time scale is about 60-year time scale. So during the 60-year, the positive phase of about 20 to 30 years of positive anomaly phase, there is 20-30 years of positive negative anomaly phase. There, the El Nino is going on in a cycle of 4 years, and there are some years it is very strong, but then it is going to the negative phase, and within that, there are a couple of years where it is going through very small SST anomaly during over the Pacific. And during those years, that SST anomaly keep persisting in the Pacific, and that SST anomaly then influence the monsoon. So it adds, when there is a strong signal, El Nino signal, it affects through the El Nino teleconnection, it affects monsoon. It doesn't bother about North Atlantic SST. But when it is going through this transition period, where there is little SST anomaly during those years, a North Atlantic SST can influence, and that adds predictability. And in fact, if we look at those years only, there is a correlation between the North Atlantic SST and Indian monsoon relationship, and that is still statistically significant, and therefore that makes sense. And this does add to. So, how do we understand then this the relationship on the multi-decadal time scale? And that we use this multi-decadal variability. So what I said just now is on the interval time scale, and then we can see, there's the same kind of teleconnection effect also works on a multi-decadal time scale, because we know there is an association on the multi-decadal time scale. Does it work, or this teleconnection is different? To do that, we use this multi-decadal signal of the ISMR and multi-decadal signal of the this. This can be extracted by the CEMD method, and so you extract this and you find out. Then you do a sort of a composite of positive phases of multi-decadal variations of Atlantic multi-decadal positive phases. For example, this is a positive phase, this is another, this is a positive phase, this is a positive. Take 20 years here and take 20 years there, and this is a negative phase and this is a negative phase. Take 20 years here and 20 years here, and do composite of sea surface the tropospheric temperature and tropospheric temperature in the positive phases of AMO, or this is multi-decadal. This AMO, sometimes we used to call it Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. But now many people don't want to call it oscillation, but multi-decadal variability is fine. So multi-decadal variability is there, but whether you call it an oscillation or not is a debatable point. But I should modify it to just variability. Positive phases of multi-decadal variability, negative phases of multi-decadal variability. If we do the tropospheric temperature composite, it and shows the opposite phases, opposite nature, and look at the negative anomaly, which is similar but even stronger negative anomaly sitting on the right place over North India. And affecting the tropospheric temperature. In fact, it increases the southern box also. It increases the tropospheric temperature and decreases it, thereby affects the tropospheric temperature even larger. This is not exactly symmetric, but similar thing happens even in the positive phase. So positive phase response is slightly different from negative phase response. That is why all the La Nina years, and then we could not really see the one-to-one correlation like the El Nino, the non-El Nino drought and cases. The non-La Nina flood years are slightly different during the this, affected by North Atlantic SST in a slightly different way. There are other internal variability which can affect the flood years or the positive monsoon. But in the drought years, the effect of El Nino, a multidigital variability seems to be rather strong. And through this only, that same framework, we can now understand that multidigital time scale also it should affect. When it happens in multidigital, that means this kind of a background as temperature anomaly remains there for several years. And on the top of that, the interannual variability will affect the tropospheric temperature gradient. And that is what we have to realize. Now, in fact, if we do that regression of those on the winds and geopotential height of the multidigital variability associated with AMO, in fact, it gives a very similar Rossby wave pattern, very similar to what we see in internal time scale. So there is something. So what seems to be happening is that these Rossby wave patterns are generated in the internal time scale, and during a positive phase, there is a more propensity of one type of one phase, positive phase of multidigital variability in the North Atlantic. There is a propensity of one set of stationary wave, and that adds up to producing, even on a multidigital time scale, a similar pattern in similar pattern of Rossby wave. Rossby wave, I think the stationary Rossby wave is same, the unit is same. The frequency of that is modulated by this multidigital variability. And this is different from the other tropic. So the tropics, now this is a kind of a teleconnection from extratropics to tropics. This is opposite to what is the teleconnection from tropics to extratropics, which people have studied, like the SST in the Pacific can influence the heat source over the Pacific, and this can produce certain waves. Wave energy can then propagate to the extratropics and affect the circulation and the climate over extratropics in this form. And this is a something called PNA pattern, Pacific North American teleconnection pattern. And this is a sort of meridional movement of meridional wave propagation, wave energy propagation, group propagation, through which the tropics is connected to the extratropics. On the other hand, here, the extratropical wave that produces this wave, stationary wave is more or less zonal. It goes around the cycle, but it has a certain extension towards the tropics and subtropics, which can influence the circulation, monsoon, climate like monsoon. So over the monsoon, this produces in the positive phase anticyclone, in the negative phase cyclonic circulation. Positive phase anticyclone will in fact enhance the monsoon, facilitate monsoon to be stronger, and whereas in the negative phase it will produce a anticyclone, and that anticyclone will then produce a sort of inhibit the convection and thereby weaken the monsoon. So this is how it does. So therefore, there is a now framework through which we can understand this extratropical to tropical connection. It is different. It is not like meridional propagation of waves, but it is simply the zonal propagation of the waves, which can lead to certain stationary structure. This actually happens on an intra-seasonal time scale, so this barotropic vorticity. These, as I mentioned earlier, that these vorticity patterns are barotropic. So these vorticity. So I can actually look at the average over this vorticity, and what is the barotropic vorticity average over this column, and look at on a daily time scale, but remove the synoptic disturbances by averaging a 5-day running mean. And if we do that, this turns out that during the positive phases of AMO, these vorticity, this is a composite of rainfall over several years of positive phases of AMO, and this is in a negative phases of AMO. And these red curves are the vorticity over that North Atlantic SST, sitting over the North Atlantic SST. And this vorticity also happens to be producing this vorticity episode in an episodic manner. This episodic vorticity seems to drive these stationary waves, and those stationary waves affect the monsoon circulation on this subseasonal time scale. That subseasonal time scale modulates the and sort of anchors the monsoon into an active phase during positive, two active phases, long active phases, and during negative phases they tend to anchor to long break phases. These long break phases, and long active phases give rise to weakening or this strengthening of the monsoon, and this is being done by these barotropic vorticity, which sets up the stationary waves, and that happens in an episodic manner on subseasonal time scale. So everything starts from subseasonal time scale, where this barotropic vorticity takes place on a subseasonal episodic manner, and that they last for about 3 weeks, then goes away, then another event takes place, another 3 weeks, it happens again. So then these things keep producing these Rossby waves, and those Rossby waves then affect locally the circulation in such a way to favor either an active phase or a break phase. And that essentially the long active and break phase leads to the increase or decrease of the seasonal rainfall. So however, people are always concerned about how, this is the question that I raised in the beginning, that that how could the SST over the North Atlantic, this is cold, produce the needed atmospheric circulation? Conventional wisdom is that in the extratropics, in the tropics, the SST is the driver of circulation because it initiates convection, and atmosphere is unstable and sort of conditionally unstable. So small lifting can generate convection and then sustain it. But in the extratropics, the atmosphere is very stable, and the mean temperature is very low, and mean SST is very low. Therefore, even a large SST anomaly, even if it's a 4-degree anomaly over 18 degrees, 18 plus 4 is only 20, and the Clausius-Clapeyron will tell us that it just will not evaporate much, and therefore not much evaporation will take place. So how will it affect the atmosphere? That was the conventional wisdom is that it is the atmosphere who is driving the SST through fluxes rather than SST driving the atmosphere in the extratropic. And the tropics, it is the other way around. So so it is still a problem. How do you understand that? And we have a and the other thing that was there also is that the question is that causality. Of course, association is there between sea surface temperature in North Atlantic and the ISMR, but is it one is driving the other, or ISMR is affecting in some way the North Atlantic SST? So we don't know. So we have to then actually resolve the causality issue as well. So so two things we did is that we showed that indeed the sea surface temperatures can influence the atmospheric the circulation or the barotropic vorticity. Not on day-to-day time scale. In the day-to-day time scale, indeed, atmosphere affects the SST. But if you allow some persistent systems, then the atmosphere SST itself affect the atmosphere. So on a slower time scale, subseasonal, intraseasonal time scale, not on a day-to-day time scale, So for that, what we did is we looked at the weekly SST and weekly barotropic vorticity. So average out the weather disturbances, and then correlate weekly SST with the barotropic vorticity at every grid point, and correlate that. And that also correlate that with lead and lag, and it turns out then when SST leads by 1 week, the SST strongly correlates negatively with the barotropic vorticity in the North Atlantic as well as in North Pacific. And that is, which means that SST leads. So it indicates that there is a possibility now how SST could influence the barotropic vorticity. And how does it do that? It is still not, some modeling studies have indicated that that SST can produce this initially baroclinic response, but the Rossby waves, vertical propagation of the Rossby waves over a period of time, if you persist, that can generate a barotropic response, and the barotropic vorticity can be generated. And this is still a debate. There is still some debate on this, and it is not. Unfortunately, we have not been able to do much of a modeling experiments due to certain the limitations. But there is now better sort of understanding that there is a possibility that SST could influence the barotropic vorticity, in fact, drive the barotropic vorticity. And to do that, we have done that by now more statistical way by using causal inference techniques. Now, causal inference, there are different ways of causal inference, the Granger causality. I'm not going to go, I think we are running out of time also. We are not going to go into details, but just highlight this and then leave it at that. So we used the two different types of causal inference technique, the Granger causality as well as the MCI method. These two are slightly different algorithms, but uses slightly different assumptions. But by doing this, what we did is we created a time series of these, the El Nino time series, the Indian Ocean dipole time series. So here actually we said that, okay, we assume that, okay, there are other time series also could affect the monsoon. So use all these different time series and see whether they are independent, because these causal inference time series also check the independentness sort of from the other time series. And so we use Indian Ocean dipole, the PDO signal here, the Atlantic Nino signal there, and even the NAO, North Atlantic Oscillation signal here. And there's of course the AMO signal or the multidigital Atlantic multidigital variability signal here. It turns out that and these connection, these arrows shows that this is simultaneous correction. These bent arrows are called sort of delayed connections. And these means that these are confounded. It is not possible to identify clearly who is affecting whom. And so this connection between Nino and IOD are not very clear. Similarly, Nino and AMO are not very clear. But what is clear is that AMO has a driving influence on monsoon with a 3-month lead, and Nino has simultaneously a driving connection with monsoon, and monsoon has a driving connection with Nino with a 1-month lead. And so it makes sense, because from our correlation we thought that ENSO-monsoon relationship may be 2 ways, but on the other hand, the AMO is just 1 way. We do not get a very strong connection between the IOD and monsoon. It seems to be dependent on the data set, and we checked it with different data sets, and these 2 connections appears to be the El Nino and monsoon connection, and AMO and monsoon connection seems to be robust, and it appears in all the SST data set that you use and so on. We have also looked at this subseasonal teleconnection, which also seems to consistent with what we think. So from this causal inference, I think what is coming out is rather interesting, that North Atlantic SST and Nino are two important drivers of monsoon, and they are of somewhat similar strength. And they seem to be independent of each other, because this independence, sort of, at least statistically, has been checked with these causal inference techniques. Now, also the IOD ISMR relationship seems to be, there is some data sets show some actually positive connection with IOD, which has been seen through some correlation analysis. But some data sets don't show that. So in our opinion, the IOD ISMR relationship is somewhat weak, and it depends, or rather sensitive to the data that we use. So the other thing that comes out from this is that because they are independent, so this North Atlantic SST also contributes to the predictability of monsoon, and because they are independent of each other. But also it is important because also it is consistent with the fact that North Atlantic SST actually affects monsoon only when the El Nino is weak, and that is when it adds predictability. So therefore, both ways it is consistent. Therefore, the North Atlantic SST is an important contributor to predictability of the monsoon. So with that, I will stop.